A heat island is an area in the city where it's significantly hotter than the surrounding areas. It can be because of impervious surfaces like asphalt, parking lots, and things that absorb heat and then re-emit it back into the air. And then it can also be because of low amount of tree coverage. So in areas like these parking lots, there's not a lot of trees, not a lot of canopy to provide shade. There's a lot of heat islands in Richmond, and it's actually more common to find in cities. But in some of these areas, and I talked to some people with the Science Museum about this, Jeremy Hoffman and Jennifer Gill, they were really helpful. In some of these areas, there's literally a 16-degree difference between one neighborhood and another neighborhood that's just a mile away. And so when you start to see differences like these, where there's such a large gap, obviously there's going to be different health outcomes, there's going to be different levels of income where maybe they can or cannot get air conditioning and go to cooling stations like libraries and things like that to cool down. There's vulnerability that we have to look for, which is going to be in younger kids. I'm talking 1 to 5 years old, and then also older adults and people with chronic illnesses beforehand. Those are going to be people that are more susceptible and more vulnerable to the heat. I think the hottest neighborhoods in Richmond are Scott's Addition, Diamond District, Jackson Ward, Monroe Ward, and Manchester. Those are some of the hottest neighborhoods in the city. In these different neighborhoods, you're going to find differences in the temperatures there versus the rest of the city. From the conversations that I've had with people in the community, it seems like they are taking this responsibility into their own hands until the city can really get the funds and then just get the organization to be able to implement these changes themselves. My name's Madyson, and I wrote about urban heat islands in Richmond and also how that's impacted by tree coverage. For those areas, and so
parking lots as a heat island, we get that, not that big of a deal, but talk about how it has an impact on communities where heat islands exist.
Yeah.
What made you want to do this story?
What made me want to do this story? I wanted to do this story because it was actually inspired out of another story that I did about there was a Chesapeake Bay Foundation class. It's called the Voices program, and it was a class held in Southside for adults that wanted to learn more about environmental advocacy. And it was actually really interesting because they had someone from Richmond's Office of Sustainability come in and talk about RVA Green 2050, which is part of their master plan. And when the people in the class were allowed to ask questions, many of the attendees asked about trees, and they were like, why aren't there many trees in Southside? What are we doing about the trees in this area? Why isn't there any shade for these groups of people? And so that kind of got the gears rolling, and I decided to look more into it because climate change is actually something that I'm really, really passionate about. So I looked into it, and there's lots and lots of research, especially from recent years, specifically 2021, with heat mapping projects in the city of Richmond and other cities across the country. And yeah, that kind of inspired me to follow this story.
Let me turn it up a little bit. Yeah, so I mean, name some specific areas where this is really an issue.
So
how is it impacting health outcomes?
It's impacting health outcomes because you have people that are vulnerable to the heat, and then you have people that are exposed to the heat at higher levels than others. So in a lot of these low income areas, or areas which are also happen to be areas of less tree coverage, you're going to find people who are more exposed to the heat because they're joining occupations like construction and things like that, where they're out in the heat all the time. So you may have a younger person who isn't very vulnerable to the heat, they're very healthy, but when they spend a lot of time outside, this makes them more vulnerable over a long period of time. And so
Anything else about this story that you want to share that I didn't ask?
I just think that it's interesting because like summer's always been my favorite season, but as the years go by, it's getting hotter and hotter, and there's science to back the fact that we're going to have more extremely hot days as the years go on and on. And so I think it's important to talk about climate change and talk about global warming in the context of these heat islands, because you're going to have communities that are very vulnerable to it, and there's going to be certain health outcomes that are going to put people at risk of chronic illnesses down the road. And so I just think it's a really important topic, and I'm glad I got to cover it.
Last question, how from your conversations is the city and or counties addressing these types of areas or acknowledging these types of areas?
Let me think on that.
And the answer might be they're not.
Well, you have nonprofit organizations like Southside Relief with Sherry Shannon and Amy Wentz, and you have Groundwork RVA and Hoffman partnering to do Throwing Shade RVA, which was a really great program. And you really have the citizens that are taking the problem into their own hands, which I think is good. But at the same time, Hoffman even mentioned like no city is doing all that they can. And so while we do have things like the RVA Green 2050 plan, and we also have the master plan and some other things that the city is looking forward to doing, someone has to do something now. And so
And are some of the things as simple as just planting trees, or what are some of the steps that could be taken?
yeah, trees are kind of the biggest fix for urban heat islands because they really do provide a lot of shade. But in addition to that, it's just creating green spaces instead of this giant pavement covered area that was going to be some kind of construction project, but it ended at some point. Instead of just having that sitting there, you can easily cover that with grass, or pull up the pavement, I guess, and then put grass there. And then also just put benches and areas where people can kind of relax out in the shade, but also have trees so they're not putting themselves at risk. And so it's all about trees, green space, and also a difference in building heights. When you have tall buildings, like we're in the Richmond Times-Dispatch office right now, and you have taller buildings around us, they also cast that shade. But when you have an area like say Jackson Ward, where all of the buildings are kind of the same height, there's not much variability, and there's also not that much shade being casted. So just things like that can really help a neighborhood that may be located in a heat island.